The dust of Prosperity Creek tastes like broken promises. It coats the tongue, a fine grit of failed hopes and smug judgments. Alara knows this taste intimately now. It rises from the boardwalk beneath her worn boots, stirred by the restless feet of men who have come to see the spectacle. Her spectacle. She stands alone, a small island of shame in a sea of pointing fingers and muted laughter. The mid-morning sun is a hammer, beating down on her bonnet, on the dark wool of her traveling dress, on the rigid line of her shoulders. The train, the great iron beast that carried her 1,000 miles toward a new life, is now just a distant plume of smoke, a fading whisper of possibility. It has abandoned her here, on this splintered platform, with her one small trunk and the ruin of her future. The man who was supposed to be that future, Mr. Jedediah Abernathy, stands a few yards away, his thumbs hooked in the pockets of his waistcoat. He is a man of substance, the owner of the town's mercantile, and his substance is currently being used to project an aura of profound indignation. Damaged, he says, not to her, but to the town at large, as if she were a bolt of cloth with a tear down the middle. The advertisement said a woman of good health and sturdy constitution. It said nothing of a cripple. The word hangs in the air, ugly and sharp. It finds its mark. Alara flinches, a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. Her left leg, the one that has defined her existence since the hay rake fell, throbs with a familiar, weary ache. She drags the toe of her boot in a small, nervous circle, the subtle movement betraying the limp she tries so hard to minimize. It's a tell, a confession of her flaw. From a shaded alley between the mercantile and the saloon, a man watches. He leans against the brick wall, the posture less one of indolence and more of necessity. One leg of his trousers is pinned up neatly below the knee. A heavy, worn crutch of dark, polished wood rests against his shoulder. He is a fixture of the town's periphery, a ghost who haunts its edges, rarely seen and often spoken of in low, cautionary tones. Silas, the one-legged outlaw, or so the stories went. He knows the taste of this town's judgment better than anyone. He's been drinking it down for 5 years. And as he watches the woman on the platform, her shoulders squared against a world of scorn, he tastes it again, bitter and foul, on her behalf. This was what she had feared, this raw, public humiliation. She had prayed for a man with a kind heart, a man who might see past the uneven rhythm of her walk to the strength in her hands, the honesty in her soul. Jedediah Abernathy, with his florid face and small, assessing eyes, was not that man. He is making a show of it, ensuring everyone in Prosperity Creek understands that he is the wrong party, that he has been deceived. He has no use for her, and with 3 words, spoken with the finality of a gavel, he seals her fate. "I won't have her," the crowd murmurs, a mix of pity and morbid satisfaction. The woman is cast off, alone, adrift. What will become of her? The question hangs there, a vulture circling. Alara stares at her trunk, at the scuffed leather and brass fittings that contain all she owns in the world. Her throat is tight with tears she refuses to shed. Not here, not in front of them. Then, a new sound cuts through the whispers. The rhythmic thump-scrape of a crutch on the wooden planks. The crowd parts, their curiosity shifting. Silas moves from the shadows into the harsh light. He ignores the stares, the sudden silence. His face is a mask of grim neutrality, carved by sun and hardship. He stops directly in front of Alara, his shadow falling over her. She looks up, startled, into eyes the color of a stormy sky. He pays no mind to Abernathy, dismisses the sheriff who has begun to drift closer, and ignores the gawking faces. He sees only her. He sees the tremor in her chin, the fierce pride warring with absolute despair in her eyes. He adjusts his crutch, freeing his right arm. He extends it to her, his calloused, empty hand open in a formal, almost courtly gesture. "Ma'am," he says, his voice a low rumble, rough as Hessian. "If this town has no use for a good woman, perhaps its outcasts do. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value." Before the story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. The offer hangs in the air, more shocking than Abernathy's rejection. An alliance offered in the heart of enemy territory. For a long, silent moment, Ilera could only stare at his outstretched arm, then at his face. He was an outcast, a man missing a part of himself, just as she was. In his eyes, she did not see pity. She saw something far rarer, recognition. And with a small, trembling breath that was the beginning of a new life, she laid her hand on his arm. His life and hers were irrevocably changed. The world seemed to fall away as her fingers made contact with the coarse wool of his coat sleeve. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, a sound like wind through dry leaves. Jedediah Abernathy's face, already florid, deep into the color of a ripe plum. This was an affront, a public refutation of his judgment by the town's most disreputable citizen. Silas didn't so much as glance his way. His focus was entirely on the woman whose hand now rested on his arm. It was a light touch, hesitant, yet it felt as if it weighed 100 pounds. It was the weight of trust, however fragile, however desperate. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The agreement was sealed. He had come to Prosperity Creek for flour, salt, and coffee, the same meager list of supplies he fetched every few months. The trip was always a trial. It was a journey from the quiet solitude of his cabin in the stony hills back into a world that had branded him and cast him out. He endured the averted gazes, the mothers pulling their children closer as he passed, the whispers that followed him like stray dogs. Outlaw, murderer, cripple. The words were interchangeable in their mouths. They didn't know the truth of how he'd lost his leg, only that it happened during the years he'd ridden with a crew that flirted with the wrong side of the law. They filled in the gaps with their own fearful imaginations. He had learned to wear their contempt like a second skin, a rough armor that protected the man underneath. But seeing them turn that same casual cruelty on this woman had pricked something deep inside him, a part of himself he thought had died years ago. He had watched her descend from the train, her face alight with a nervous hope that was painful to witness. He saw the way she scanned the crowd, the small, brave smile on her lips. And he saw the moment that smile faltered and died as her gaze fell upon Abernathy. He saw her limp, the slight drag of her foot that she tried to conceal with a careful, deliberate grace. It was a vulnerability, yes, but he saw the strength it took to carry it. He knew that strength intimately. His own phantom limb ached in sympathy. When Abernathy had spoken, loud and proud in his denunciation, Silas had felt a hot surge of anger, an emotion so foreign it almost choked him. It was the injustice of it. The man was judging the container and discarding the contents without a glance. In that moment, the woman, this stranger, was not just a stranger. She was him, 5 years ago, lying in a dusty ravine with a shattered leg in a world that had already decided who he was. Now, she was beside him. He could feel the slight tremor running through her arm. He gave her a steadying look. "Best we move," he murmured, his voice for her ears only. He turned, and with the deliberate, practiced rhythm of his crutch, he began to lead her away from the platform. Their passage through the main street of Prosperity Creek was a silent ordeal. Every eye was on them. 2 broken people, a matched set of imperfections, a one-legged man and a limping woman. Silas could feel the town's derision like a physical force, pressing in on them. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw set. He guided Ilera around a muddy patch, his arm a firm, protective barrier. He felt her falter once, her step uneven on a loose board, and his grip tightened instinctively, holding her steady. It was a small, practical gesture, but it felt monumental. Ilera's world had shrunk to the space she occupied beside this strange, silent man. The heat of 100 stares burned her cheeks, but the solid presence of the man beside her was a shield. She focused on the rhythm of their mismatched steps, his thump-scrape step and her own step-drag step. It was a broken cadence, a discordant melody, but it was their own. She had come to this town seeking a whole man to make her life whole. Instead, she was walking away with a man who was, by the world's measure, more broken than she was. And yet, for the first time since stepping off that train, a sliver of something other than terror began to work its way into her heart. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling, but she thought it might be security. They passed Abernathy's Mercantile, its large glass windows glinting in the sun. She could feel his gaze on her back, hot with fury and wounded pride. She did not look back. The town and its false promises were behind her. Ahead lay only the unknown, a dusty road leading out toward the brown, sun-baked hills. Silas did not take her to the hotel or the boarding house. He led her to his wagon, a sturdy, plain buckboard parked at the edge of town near the livery. A patient, old mule was tied to the hitching post, its ears twitching at the flies. Without a word, he went back for her trunk, hoisting it onto his shoulder with a grunt of effort and loading it into the wagon bed. He then turned to her, his expression unreadable. "It's a long way," he said, the words stark and without comfort. "And the cabin ain't much." It wasn't an apology. It was a statement of fact, a warning. Alara simply nodded, her throat too dry for words. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand firm and impersonal at her elbow, and then swung himself up beside her with a practiced, agile movement that belied his injury. He untied the mule, slapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward, leaving the last vestiges of Prosperity Creek behind. The journey to his home was a slow climb into the foothills. The road dwindled from a wide, rutted track to a narrow path winding through scrub oak and dust-colored boulders. The silence between them was vast, filled only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the clop of the mule's hooves. Alara clutched her hands in her lap, her mind a whirlwind. Who was this man? What had she done? She had traded one precarious situation for another, leaping from a fire of public shame into the uncertainty of this outlaw's protection. Back home, after the accident, the doctor had told her she would be lucky to avoid being a burden. Her family had loved her, but their pity was a smothering blanket. The mail-order bride advertisement had been a desperate gamble, a chance to build a life on her own terms, to be valued for her work and her character, not judged for her gait. The cruelty of Abernathy's rejection had been a confirmation of her deepest fears, that she was, as he'd said, damaged goods. But this man, Silas, he hadn't even seemed to notice her limp. Or if he hadn't cared. He had looked at her, truly looked, and seen a person in need of an ally. What he wanted from her, she couldn't guess. But as the wagon climbed higher, leaving the suffocating judgment of the town below, Alara felt the tight knot of fear in her chest loosen, just a fraction. The cabin, when they finally reached it, was exactly as he described it. It wasn't much. It was a small, solid structure of rough-hewn logs, tucked into a shallow ravine and sheltered by a stand of gnarled pines. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, suggesting a fire left to smolder. There was no barn, only a simple lean-to for the mule. A small, struggling garden was fenced off to one side, its soil rocky and unforgiving. It was a place of profound isolation, a place to disappear. Silas brought the wagon to a halt and climbed down. He turned to help her, but Alara was already moving, determined to show she was not helpless. She swung her legs over the side, but her bad leg, stiff from the long ride, refused to cooperate. She stumbled, a small cry escaping her lips as she started to fall. Before she could hit the ground, Silas was there. He caught her, his arms closing around her with a surprising strength. He held her steady for a moment, his face close to hers. She could see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the graying stubble on his jaw. He smelled of pine, dust, and something else, a faint, clean scent of lye soap. "Easy now," he grunted, setting her gently on her feet. Her face burned with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, mortified. He just shook his head, a gesture that was not dismissive but seemed to say words were unnecessary. He turned and began to unhitch the mule, his movements efficient and economical. Alara stood by the cabin door, taking it all in. This was her new reality. A lonely cabin, a silent man, and a future as blank and vast as the sky above. She took a deep breath of the clean, crisp air. It was thin and sharp, so different from the thick, judgmental atmosphere of the town. For better or worse, this was a new beginning. The first 24 hours in the cabin passed in a state of suspended reality. Silas moved with a quiet, self-contained purpose, fetching water from a nearby spring-fed creek, tending to his mule, and stoking the fire in the hearth. He seemed largely unaware of her presence, or at least he was adept at acting as if he were. He gave her a corner of the single room for her trunk and pointed to a narrow cot that would be hers. He slept on a rough pallet of blankets near the fire. Their conversation was sparse, limited to the essentials. "There's coffee, the privy's out back, might rain tonight." Each word seemed to cost him something. Alara, for her part, was coiled tight with uncertainty. She watched him, trying to read the man who had so unexpectedly intervened in her life. He was not the brutish monster the town's whisper suggested. His hands, though calloused, were surprisingly deft as he mended a piece of tack. He owned a small shelf of books, Shakespeare, a book of poetry, a well-thumbed history of the Roman Empire, that seemed utterly at odds with the image of an outlaw. Yet there was a hardness to him, a wariness in his eyes that spoke of a past he kept locked away. The first test of their strange arrangement came the following afternoon. Alara was sweeping the dirt floor, the familiar, rhythmic motion a small comfort in this alien environment, when the sound of approaching horses broke the stillness. Silas, who had been chopping wood outside, went still. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his body tensing. He didn't reach for the rifle that leaned against the cabin wall, but his eyes darted to it, a flicker of instinct. "Stay inside," he said, his voice low and flat. A moment later, two riders emerged from the trees. One was the sheriff, a portly man with a weary expression. The other was Jedediah Abernathy. His face was a thundercloud of self-righteous fury. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin. Abernathy didn't dismount. He looked down his nose at Silas, as if he were something unpleasant he'd found on his shoe. "Silas," the sheriff said, his tone tired. "Mr. Abernathy here has lodged a complaint." "Is that so?" Silas replied, his voice devoid of emotion. He leaned on his axe handle, his one good leg planted firmly. "He says you absconded with his intended bride," the sheriff continued, sighing. "Now, I saw what happened, but Abernathy's kicking up a fuss, talking about vagrancy, kidnapping. She came of her own free will," Silas stated simply. "Is that her in there?" Abernathy demanded, pointing a fat finger at the cabin door. "Hiding her away, are you? What's a crippled outlaw, like you want with her anyway? You've tainted her. No decent man will have her now." From inside the cabin, Alara heard every word. The shame washed over her again, hot and sickening. Tainted, damaged. The words echoed Abernathy's initial rejection. She pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting a wave of nausea. Silas's knuckles whitened on the axe handle. A muscle twitched in his jaw. For a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, taut and dangerous. Alara held her breath. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying with deadly clarity. "The lady was insulted and abandoned. I offered her shelter. That's the whole of it. What happens now is her decision, not yours, Abernathy, and not yours, Sheriff." He looked from one man to the other. "She's under my protection. You could tell the good people of Prosperity Creek that." Abernathy sputtered, his face purpling. "Protection? You? That's a laugh. Sheriff, you have to." "That's enough, Jedediah." The sheriff cut in, his weariness replaced by a flicker of authority. He looked at Silas, then at the closed cabin door. He was a man caught between the town's most influential citizen and its most stubborn outcast. The lady ain't his wife. She ain't his property. If she wants to leave, I'll see she gets a room at the hotel. If she wants to stay, well, that's her business. He turned his horse. "Let's go, Jedediah. You've had your say." Abernathy shot one last look of pure venom at Silas and the cabin before wheeling his horse around and following the sheriff back down the path. The sound of their departure faded leaving an unnerving silence in its wake. Silas stood motionless for a long time before finally driving his axe into the chopping block and turning toward the cabin. He entered, his face grim. He didn't look at Alara, but he was acutely aware of her standing in the shadows, trembling. "He'll be back," Silas said to the floor, "or he'll find another way." Alara finally found her voice, though it was small and shaky. "I'm sorry to have brought this trouble to you." He finally looked at her, his stormy eyes meeting hers. "This ain't your trouble," he said, and there was a surprising ferocity in his voice. "This is his. Don't you ever be sorry for that man's lack of decency." He paused, his gaze softening almost imperceptibly. "The sheriff was right, though. It's your choice. You can go back with him next time. I got a little money saved. Enough for a ticket east." He was offering her an escape from him, from this isolated life, from the trouble she had inadvertently caused. She could take it. She could run. But where would she run to? Back to a family who saw her as a burden? To another town, another roll of the dice with another man who would see only her limp? She looked around the small, rough cabin. It was nothing. A single room, a dirt floor, a cot. But on the last day, she had been treated with more dignity here than she had in years. This silent, wounded man had stood up for her. He had called Abernathy's cruelty what it was. He had offered her his protection, and now, his last dollars for her freedom. Alara straightened her shoulders. She met his gaze without flinching. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not running. If it's all the same to you, I'll stay." A look of profound surprise crossed Silas's face. It was not the answer he had expected. He stared at her for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. He saw not a victim, but a woman making a stand. He gave a slow, single nod. The matter was settled. They were in this together. The days settled into a new, unspoken rhythm. A partnership forged in silence, and necessity began to take root in the rocky soil of Silas's seclusion. Alara rose with the dawn, the habit of a lifetime on the farm ingrained too deep to shake. At first, she moved with hesitation, unsure of her place, of the boundaries in this small, shared space. But the cabin's needs were plain, and work was a language she understood better than words. She took over the cooking. Silas's meals had been functional affairs. Salt pork fried in a skillet, beans boiled to a tasteless mush. Alara, using the meager supplies from his last trip to town, worked small miracles. She found wild onions and hardy herbs growing near the creek. She learned to make a decent sourdough starter, and soon the cabin was filled with the warm, comforting scent of baking bread. She noticed Silas ate with a quiet, almost startled appreciation, though he never commented directly. His gratitude was in the way he'd leave an extra piece of firewood by the hearth for her in the morning, or ensure the water bucket was always full. Their shared disabilities became a silent point of connection. She saw how, at the end of the day, Silas would massage the stump of his leg, his face tight with a pain he never spoke of. She saw the effort it cost him to navigate the uneven ground around the cabin. He, in turn, began to anticipate her needs. He built a small, sturdy stool and placed it by the hearth so she could sit and work without having to get up and down as often. When they walked to the spring together, he instinctively slowed his pace to match hers, finding the smoothest path without drawing attention to it. They never spoke of their injuries, but there was a deep, resonant understanding between them. They knew what it was to live in a body that had betrayed you, to be defined by a part that was missing or broken. One afternoon, as she was mending one of his shirts, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, the seams frayed, she discovered a hidden skill. The needle felt natural in her hands, and her stitches were small and neat. Silas watched her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "My mother taught me," she said, not looking up, feeling the need to fill the silence. "She said a woman with a good needle is never useless." The words came out with a bitter edge she hadn't intended. Silas was quiet for a moment. "My pa used to say a man who can read a book is never alone," he replied, his voice soft. He nodded toward a small shelf. Seems they were both right. It was the longest conversation they'd had. a small bridge built between their two solitudes. After that, the silence felt different, less awkward, more companionable. The outside world, however, did not forget them. When their supplies ran low a month later, the trip to Prosperity Creek was a necessity they both dreaded. Silas knew he couldn't leave her alone at the cabin, not with Abernathy nursing his wounded pride. They would have to go together. The moment their wagon appeared on the main street, a hush fell over the town. Windows that had been empty suddenly held curious faces. Conversations on the boardwalk stopped mid-sentence. They were a curiosity, a scandal, the talk of the town. Alara kept her eyes fixed on the mule's ears, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. Silas pulled up in front of the mercantile. Abernathy's mercantile. It was unavoidable. As Silas climbed down, Abernathy himself appeared in the doorway, blocking the entrance. He had a smug, proprietary look on his face. Well, he said, his voice loud enough for the whole street to hear. Look what the cat dragged in. Come for a handout, Silas. Silas ignored him, his face a granite mask. Need flour and coffee, he said, his voice flat. My flour? My coffee. Abernathy laughed, a short, ugly sound. I don't serve your kind. Or hers. He looked past Silas to Alara, his eyes filled with contempt. Tell me, girl, has he been treating you well? Or has living with that broken-down outlaw made you appreciate what you threw away? Alara felt a hot flush of shame and anger. Before she could find her voice, Silas took a half-step forward. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't make a threat. He simply moved into Abernathy's space, a silent, menacing presence. The lady is with me, Silas said, his voice dangerously low. You will not speak to her. You will sell me my supplies, and then we will be on our way. The two men locked eyes. Abernathy, for all his bluster, was a man of commerce, not conflict. He saw something in Silas's stormy eyes that made him quail. It wasn't the look of a common brawler. It was something colder, harder. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to lose and would defend the one thing he had. Muttering under his breath, Abernathy stepped aside. Silas entered the store. The transaction was completed in tense silence. As Silas emerged with his sacks, a young boy, no older than 10 and egged on by his friends, darted forward and threw a small stone. It struck the side of the wagon with a sharp crack, inches from Alara's head. Outlaw's woman, the boy yelled, before turning and fleeing. Alara gasped, her hand flying to her cheek. Silas dropped the sacks into the wagon bed with a thud. He whirled around, his eyes scanning the street, a look of such cold fury on his face that even the onlookers took a step back. But the boys were gone, vanished into an alleyway. He said nothing. He climbed back onto the wagon seat, his movements stiff with rage. The ride back to the cabin was heavy with unspoken tension. The town's poison had followed them. It had touched her. That night, they sat by the fire, the mood somber. The small bubble of peace they had built around their cabin had been pierced. Alara felt a familiar despair creeping back in. She was a curse, a source of trouble. She was ruining this man's quiet life, drawing the world's hatred to his doorstep. I should go, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He was right. You taking me in, it has tainted you. Silas, who had been staring into the flames, looked up sharply. His face was grim in the firelight. No, he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. Don't you say that. Don't you ever let their filth become your truth. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Alara, that boy, the whispers, that ain't about you. It's about them. It's about their own fear. They look at you, they look at me, and they see everything they're afraid of becoming. Alone, outcast, different. Their hate is a shield. It's got nothing to do with your worth. He had never spoken so many words to her at once. He had never said her name before. Alara. It sounded strange and beautiful in his rough voice. She stared at him, seeing past the outlaw, past the cripple, to the man inside, a man of profound, unexpected insight, a man who understood shame because he had lived it. He reached across the small space between them and, With a hesitant gesture, his calloused fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek. It was the slightest of touches, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body. It was not a touch of pity or of ownership. It was a touch of connection, of shared humanity. "We ain't tainted," he said softly, his hand dropping away. "We're survivors." In that moment, something shifted irrevocably between them. The fragile walls she had kept around her heart began to crumble. She was not just a burden he had taken on, and he was not just a rescuer. They were allies, partners. And for the first time, looking at the one-legged outlaw across the fire, Alara felt a flicker of something she had long ago given up on. Hope. The hope that maybe, just maybe, two broken people could make each other whole. The first snows came early that year, dusting the high peaks with white and sending a chill wind down through the ravine. The world outside the cabin shrank, and their own small world became more concentrated, more intense. The threat of Abernathy and the town receded, replaced by the more immediate challenges of survival. Chopping enough wood to last through a storm, securing the last of the vegetables from the garden, sealing the cracks in the cabin walls with mud and moss. They worked together, a well-practiced team. He had the brute strength for splitting logs. She had the dexterity for the chinking. He could reach the high shelves. She could see the tiny holes in a seam that needed mending. Their individual weaknesses were compensated for by the other's strengths. In the quiet industry of their shared labor, a deep and comfortable intimacy grew, woven from threads of mutual respect and unspoken understanding. One evening, a blizzard descended from the mountains without warning. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, rattling the cabin's single window and driving snow into every conceivable crack. They were trapped, isolated from the rest of the world in their small pocket of warmth and light. The fire roared in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced on the log walls. The storm raged for 2 days. The forced proximity stripped away the last vestiges of formality between them. They shared meals from the same pot, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they moved about the small space. The silence was no longer a void to be filled, but a shared blanket of peace. On the second night of the storm, with the wind shrieking outside, Alara sat by the fire, darning one of Silas's socks. The rhythmic pull of a needle was a soothing balm. Silas was cleaning his rifle, the metallic click sharp and precise in the otherwise quiet room. "You never told me," he said, his voice startling her. He wasn't looking at her, his attention focused on the rifle's action. How it happened. She knew immediately what he meant. Her leg. They had never spoken of it directly, this shared, unspoken bond of their injuries. She paused her mending, the needle still in the wool. She had never told anyone the full story, not really. Her family knew the basic facts, but they had never understood the choice she had made in that split second. To them, it was just a tragic, clumsy accident. "I was 14, she began, her voice soft, barely audible above the wind. "We were bringing in the last of the hay before storm. My little brother, Thomas, he was only 6. He wasn't supposed to be in the barn, but he'd followed me in. She could see it as if it were yesterday. The cavernous gloom of the barn, the sweet, dusty smell of hay, the rumble of distant thunder. There was an old hay rake leaning against a loft beam. A heavy one, all iron. The vibration from the wind, or maybe I bumped it, I don't know, it started to fall. Right where Thomas was standing, looking up at a bird's nest, her hands stilled in her lap. Silas had stopped his work. He was watching her now, his face intent in the firelight. "I didn't think," she whispered. "I just moved. I shoved him out of the way. Hard." He went tumbling into a pile of loose hay, screaming. And the rake, it came down on my leg. She instinctively touched her thigh. The memory of the sharp, searing pain as fresh as if it had just happened. It shattered the bone. The doctor did what he could, but it never set right. She finished her story and looked down at her hands, expecting the usual reaction, pity. A sad shake of the head. A platitude about her bravery, followed by the unspoken thought that it had ruined her. But Silas was silent. When she finally dared to look at him, she saw no pity in his eyes. She saw a profound, gut-wrenching understanding. "You saved him," he said, his voice thick with a strange emotion. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice. You chose to save him. Tears pricked at Alara's eyes. No one had ever said it like that before. No one had seen it as a choice, as an act of will, an act of love. They had only ever seen the result, the limp, the flaw. And you? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. You never told me either. His face hardened, the familiar mask of the outcast slipping back into place. He looked away from her, back toward the fire. It ain't a heroic story like yours. Tell me, she urged gently. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that seemed to carry years of weight. I rode with a man named Cole. A long time ago. We weren't saints, but we weren't killers either. Mostly we moved cattle, some of it with brands that weren't ours. We were young and stupid. He shifted, the movement betraying his discomfort. We got pinned down in a canyon by a posse. A misunderstanding over some horses that got ugly fast. Shots were fired. Cole was hit. I was trying to drag him behind some rocks when my horse went down, rolled on me, pinned my leg against a boulder. He fell silent, the memories playing across his face. The posse, they weren't interested in talking. They just kept shooting. I lay there for hours after they left, listening to Cole die. Took him a long time. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but Alara could feel the agony coiled beneath the surface. By the time I managed to get free, the leg was ruined. Gangrene had set in by the time I made it to a town. Doc took it off with a butcher's saw. They called you an outlaw, Alara whispered. A murderer. Easier story, Silas said with a bitter shrug. Posse claims they ran off a gang of killers. I was the one who got away, maimed and marked. The one they could point to. The story got bigger with every telling. By the time I ended up here, I was a legend I didn't recognize. They sat in silence, the storm raging around them, the fire crackling between them. They had finally shared the stories of their scars, the events that had shaped them, that had set them on a path to this isolated cabin. Her scar was a mark of love and sacrifice. His was a mark of survival and betrayal. He finally turned back to her, his gaze raw and vulnerable. That man, Abernathy, he said, his voice low. He looks at you and sees a damaged woman. He looks at me and sees a dangerous man. He's blind. He doesn't see that your limp is a sign of your strength. And he doesn't see that my leg, it's just a piece of me that's gone. It ain't the whole of me. In that moment, in the heart of the blizzard, the last wall between them dissolved. He was not just Silas, the one-legged outlaw, and she was not just Alara, the limping mail-order bride. They were two people who had looked into the abyss of their pasts and shared the truth of what they found there. As the storm began to quiet in the pre-dawn hours, Alara awoke to find her blanket had slipped off her cot. She was shivering. Before she could reach for it, a heavy wool blanket was draped over her. Silas was standing there, a dark silhouette against the dying embers of the fire. He tucked it in around her shoulders, his movements gentle, almost tender. He thought she was asleep. As he turned to go back to his own pallet, she reached out and her fingers brushed his hand. He froze. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered into the darkness. He stood there for a long moment. Then his fingers briefly, firmly, squeezed hers before he pulled away. It was a promise, a confirmation, an acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. In the shelter of the cabin, surrounded by the silence of the snow, they had found their own kind of peace. But they both knew the world outside, and men like Abernathy had not gone away. The thaw would come, and with it, another kind of storm. The blizzard broke, leaving the world transformed, draped in a blanket of pristine, silent white. The beauty was stark and absolute, but it was also a harbinger of trouble. The deep snow meant the path to town was impassable. Their supplies, already low before the storm, became dangerously scarce. The flour was gone, the coffee a memory. They were down to the last of the salted meat and a few handfuls of dried beans. For the first time, a new kind of fear entered the cabin, the quiet, gnawing fear of starvation. It was a tangible presence, sitting with them at their meager meals, watching them as they slept. But it was a fear they faced together. Silas took his rifle and spent long, arduous days wading through waist-deep snow, hunting for anything, a rabbit, a squirrel. He often came back empty-handed, his face etched with exhaustion and frustration. Alara stretched their remaining food with a desperate ingenuity, making thin, watery broths that were more hope than sustenance. One evening, after another fruitless day, Silas returned, his face gray with fatigue. He slumped onto his stool by the fire, the rifle leaning against the wall, and didn't speak. The silence in the cabin was heavy with failure. Alara brought him a cup of hot water, her own stomach aching with hunger. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "The animals are holed up. Nothing is moving." He looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "I brought you here," he said, his voice raspy. "Offered you protection. Now I'm going to watch you starve." The guilt was eating him alive, a poison far worse than the hunger. Alara knelt before him, taking the cup from his unsteady hand and setting it aside. She placed her hands on his knees, forcing him to look at her. "Silas, look at me." Her voice was firm, imbued with the strength he had given her. "When you found me on that platform, I was starving then. Not for food, but for a shred of dignity, for a safe place to stand. You gave me that. We've weathered one kind of storm. We can weather this one. Together." His shoulders slumped, the rigid lines of his body softening in surrender. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumbs stroking her skin. "Alara," he breathed, her name a prayer. As the snow finally began to melt, a new and more immediate threat arrived. It came in the form of the sheriff, his horse struggling through the slushy, half-frozen mud of the path. He looked grim and deeply uncomfortable. "Silas." "Ma'am," he said, nodding to Alara as he dismounted. "I'm afraid I'm here on official business." Silas moved to stand in the doorway, a silent protector. "What business?" "It's Abernathy," the sheriff sighed, taking off his hat and wiping his brow, though the air was cold. "He hasn't let it go. He's been to the circuit judge. He's filed a formal petition. He's claiming Miss Alara is an indentured woman. He paid her passage, sent her money for the journey. He's claiming that, by law, she's obligated to him, either to marry him or to work off the debt." Alara felt the blood drain from her face. She had forgotten about the money Abernathy had sent. A ticket and $20 for expenses. It had seemed like a fortune then. Now it was a chain around her neck. "He doesn't want to marry her," Silas said, his voice cold as ice. "He made that clear enough." "No," the sheriff agreed. "He wants to make an example of her. He wants her to work at the mercantile, as a scullery maid, sweeping floors. He told the judge he wants to teach her a lesson in humility." The sheriff looked disgusted. "The judge is a stickler for the letter of the law. He's given me a court order. He says you're holding her here against her legal obligations. He's given you a deadline. 3 days from now, on Saturday, you're to bring her to the town hall. She's to testify. If she doesn't agree to fulfill her contract with Abernathy, the judge is prepared to have her arrested for fraud and vagrancy." The world tilted on its axis. Abernathy had found a way. He would not have her as a wife, so he would have her as a slave, a public spectacle of his power and her shame. To be forced to work for him, to endure his daily taunts and the town's scorn. It was a fate worse than any she could imagine. After the sheriff left, a crushing despair settled over the cabin. Their sanctuary had been breached. The law, the tool of the righteous, was being twisted into a weapon against them. That night, Silas sat by the fire, staring into the flames for hours. Alara watched him, her heart aching for the burden she had placed on him. Finally, he turned to her, his face a grim mask of resolution. "There's a way out of this," he said, his voice low. "For you." He stood up and went to a loose stone in the hearth, prying it up. From the hollow beneath, he pulled out a small, leather pouch. He emptied its contents onto the table. A small pile of gold coins gleamed in the firelight. It was his life savings. "It's not much," he said, "but it should be enough to pay him back what he sent you. And enough for a ticket. Somewhere far away. California, maybe Oregon. Somewhere he can't reach you." He pushed the coins toward her. "You can leave tonight. I'll take you to the next town, put you on a train going west. No one will know." He was offering her freedom, a clean break, a new life, bought with every penny he had in the world. He was willing to be left alone again, to face Abernathy in the towns gloating by himself, just so she could be safe. The depth of his sacrifice was a physical blow. Tears streamed down Alara's face, but they were not tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of a fierce, overwhelming love. She looked at the gold coins, then at his face, at the pain and resolve in his eyes. She thought of the life he was offering her, a life on the run, a life alone. And she thought of the life she had here, in this poor, isolated cabin with this broken, beautiful man. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed the coins back across the table toward him. "No," she said, her voice shaking but clear. He stared at her, confused. "Alara, you don't understand. He'll destroy you." "Let him try," she said, a fire kindling in her eyes. "You told me we were survivors. You told me not to let their filth become my truth. Are you going to let his? Are we going to let him chase us away from our home?" "This is my home," he corrected her gently. "It doesn't have to be yours. You don't owe me anything." "I owe you everything," she shot back, standing to face him. "You showed me that my limp doesn't define me. Well, your missing leg doesn't define you, and his twisted laws won't define us. I am not leaving. I'm not running." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "On Saturday, we'll go to town. But we won't go so I can testify. We'll go to face him. Together." A look of stunned disbelief washed over Silas's face, followed by a slow, spreading wave of something else. It was pride. It was awe. He looked at the woman standing before him. No longer the frightened, shamed creature from the train platform, but a warrior. His warrior. He reached out and took her hands in his. His were rough and calloused. Hers were trembling but strong. Together, he echoed, his voice thick. The decision was made. They would not run. They would make their stand. Saturday morning dawned cold and clear. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the air was sharp with the lingering chill of winter. There was a sense of finality to the day, as if the world itself were holding its breath. They ate their meager breakfast in silence, the unspoken weight of what lay ahead filling the small cabin. Alara dressed in the same dark wool dress she had arrived in, but felt different now. It was no longer the uniform of a hopeful bride, but the armor of a woman prepared for battle. She braided her hair with steady, deliberate fingers, her reflection in the small, cracked mirror showing a face that was thinner, paler, but possessed a resolve that had not been there before. Silas wore his cleanest shirt. He had shaved that morning, his jaw sharp and defined. When he stood, leaning on his crutch, he seemed taller, his presence more formidable than ever. He looked at Alara, a long, searching look. He gave a single, firm nod. No more words were needed. The journey to town was a reversal of their first trip together. Then, she had been a frightened refugee, and he a reluctant savior. Now, they were partners, riding to face a common enemy. The mule's pace seemed funereal, each step bringing them closer to the confrontation that would define their future. As they reached the edge of Prosperity Creek, they could already feel the tension. The town was busier than usual. People were gathered in small groups on the boardwalks, their faces a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Abernathy had made sure this would be a public spectacle. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to be seen winning. They dismounted in front of the town hall, a plain, clapboard building that also served as the sheriff's office. The crowd fell silent as they approached, parting to let them pass. The stares were still there, but they were different now, less scornful, more curious, tinged with a grudging respect for their audacity. They walked side by side, their mismatched gait a declaration of defiance. Thump, scrape, step. Step, drag, step. The sound echoed in the stillness. Alara held her head high, her gaze fixed forward. She could feel Silas beside her, a solid, unshakable wall of support. Abernathy was waiting for them on the steps of the town hall, flanked by the sheriff and a stern-looking man with a gray beard and spectacles whom Alara assumed was the circuit judge. Abernathy was dressed in his Sunday best, a smug, triumphant smile playing on his lips. He looked from Alara to Silas, his eyes glittering with malice. Well, he boomed, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. Look who finally decided to face the law. Have you come to your senses, girl? Are you ready to admit your folly and accept your rightful place? Alara felt a tremor of fear, but she met his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. It was the judge who spoke next, his voice dry and official. Miss? He trailed off, not knowing her last name. My name is Alara Vance, she said, her voice clear and steady, surprising even herself. Miss Vance, the judge said, Mr. Abernathy has presented a compelling legal argument. He has receipts for your passage and for monies advanced. The law of indenture is quite clear. You have a debt to repay. Do you deny this? This was it, the moment of truth. All eyes were on her. She took a breath, feeling Silas's presence beside her, a silent anchor. I do not deny the money, Your Honor, she said. But the contract Mr. Abernathy speaks of was for a marriage, a partnership. He publicly and cruelly broke that contract the moment I stepped off the train, simply because he found fault with my appearance. Abernathy scoffed. The contract stipulated a bride of good health. A woman with a limp is not of good health. She is damaged. Is she? A low voice cut in. All heads turned to Silas. He had been silent until now, a thundercloud waiting to break. He took a single step forward, planting his crutch firmly on the wooden step. Your Honor, he said, his voice a low rumble that commanded attention. You speak of the law. Let's speak of value. Mr. Abernathy here is the owner of the town mercantile. He deals in goods. He weighs, he measures, he sets a price. And that is how he saw Miss Vance, as a piece of merchandise that did not meet his specifications. So he discarded her. He turned his piercing gaze on Abernathy, who visibly shrank back. You saw a flaw, Silas said, his voice laced with contempt. And you saw nothing else. You saw a limp, and you were blind to the fact that this woman has more strength, more courage, and more decency in her little finger than you have in your entire corpulent body. A murmur went through the crowd. But I, Silas continued, his voice rising slightly, I am not a merchant. I do not deal in goods. I have learned to look past the surface. And when I looked at Miss Vance, I did not see a flaw. I saw a woman being wronged. I saw a person. He turned back to the judge, his eyes blazing. He wants to speak of debts? Let's speak of the debt of human decency, a debt he has clearly defaulted on. Then he did something no one expected. He turned to Alara, and in front of the entire town, he took her hand. But the matter of the financial debt is easily settled. From his pocket. He pulled the small leather pouch of gold coins. With his free hand, he tossed it onto the steps at Abernathy's feet. It landed with a heavy, definitive chink. There, Silas declared. There is your money, Abernathy. Your 30 pieces of silver. You are repaid in full. Abernathy stared at the pouch as if it were a snake. The crowd gasped. But it was Alara who delivered the final, devastating blow. She stepped forward, her hand still held firmly in Silas's. She looked not at the judge, but the faces in the crowd, the women, the men, the children who had stared and whispered. Mr. Abernathy rejected me because I am not whole, she said, her voice ringing with passion and clarity. He is right. I am not. And neither is this man beside me. She squeezed Silas's hand. But our missing pieces, our scars, they do not make us less. They are a part of who we are. They are the marks of our survival. She looked directly at Abernathy, her eyes shining with unshed tears, but her voice unwavering. You call him an outlaw? His quiet integrity is worth more than all the gold in your store. You call me damaged? My limp is the price I paid for my brother's life. I would pay it again 1,000 times over. Her voice dropped, becoming a near whisper, yet everyone heard it. You see us as broken, but together, we are more whole than you will ever be. A profound silence fell over the town square. In that moment, the narrative had been flipped. The shame was no longer on Alara and Silas. It was a heavy cloak that had settled squarely on Jedediah Abernathy's shoulders. The townspeople looked at him, then at the couple standing proudly on the steps, and they saw not two cripples, but two people of immense character. They saw the truth. The sheriff, who had been watching the whole exchange with a slow dawning expression of respect, stepped forward. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice firm, "I believe the debt has been paid. And as for any other contract, it seems to me Miss Vance has made her choice." The judge looked from Alara's resolute face to Silas's unyielding one. He looked at the pouch of gold and at Abernathy's stunned, humiliated expression. He cleared his throat. "Indeed," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "the matter is settled." With that, he turned and went inside the town hall. The show was over. The power of public opinion, once Abernathy's greatest weapon, had been turned against him. He stood alone on the steps, his victory turned to ash in his mouth. Silas and Alara, their hands still clasped together, turned without another word and walked away. The crowd parted for them, but this time it was a path of respect. Their mismatched steps echoed on the boardwalk, no longer a broken cadence, but a rhythm of triumph. The ride back to the hills was made in a shared, reverent silence. The air itself felt lighter, cleansed. The weight of judgment, a burden they had both carried for so long, had been lifted. When their cabin came into view, nestled in its secluded ravine, it looked different. It was no longer a refuge from the world, a place to hide. It was a home they had fought for. It was their fortress. Inside, the familiar quiet enveloped them, but it was a quiet filled with relief and a deep, unspoken joy. The confrontation had drained them, but had also forged the final link in the chain that bound them together. They had faced the world and chosen each other. Later that afternoon, the weariness gave way to a profound sense of peace. Silas sat on the small porch he had built, oiling the hinge on a loose shutter. The repetitive, practical task was grounding. The sun was warm on his shoulders, and the air smelled of pine and damp earth. Alara came out of the cabin, holding 2 steaming mugs. She walked over to him, her limp a familiar, graceful part of her movement, no longer a source of shame, but simply a fact, like the color of her eyes. She handed him one of the mugs. Their fingers brushed, a brief, warm touch that spoke volumes. She didn't move away. She stood beside him, one hand resting on the porch rail, and looked out at the vast expanse of hills and sky that was their domain. He watched her for a moment, the way the sun caught the gold in her hair, the quiet contentment on her face. He had offered her his arm on a train platform out of a moment of impulsive empathy, an act of defiance against a cruel world. He had thought he was rescuing her. He realized now, with stunning clarity, that she had been rescuing him all along. She had breached the walls of his solitude, shown him a path back from the bitter exile he had chosen for himself. He had offered her shelter, and she had turned his house into a home. Without a word, she lowered her hand from the rail and rested it gently on his shoulder. It was a simple gesture, one of comfort and belonging. He stopped his work and looked up at her, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face, a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness that she had never seen before. He reached up, covering her hand with his own. His was rough and scarred. Hers was slender but strong. They fit together perfectly. They stood there for a long time, their hands joined, saying nothing. They looked out at the rugged landscape, at the endless sky, their shared sanctuary. The world had called them broken, but here, in this quiet moment, they were complete. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.